And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
BBC spokespersons told GBNews while we don't comment on leaked documents, when the BBC receives feedback it takes it seriously and considers it carefully. Michael Prescott is a former advisor to a board committee where differing views and opinions of our coverage are routinely discussed and debated. The Home Secretary says the man suspected of Saturday's mass stabbing attack on a train in Cambridgeshire was not previously known to security services. Police are investigating whether 32-year-old Anthony Williams is linked to 3 other knife incidents in Peterborough over the weekend. He's appeared in court charged with 11 counts of attempted murder over Saturday's stabbings and a separate attack hours earlier in East London. Shabana Mahmood has thanked emergency services for their quick response and has paid tribute to the bravery of all passengers and staff on the train, including Andrew Johnson, an Iraq War veteran who intercepted the attacker.
He put himself in harm's way, suffered grievous injuries as a result, and remains in hospital today in a critical but stable condition. On Saturday, he went to work to do his job. Today, he is a hero and forever will be.
The Foreign Secretary is calling for Israel to allow more aid into Gaza following last month's tentative ceasefire. Authorities there say only a fraction of deliveries agreed as part of the US brokered deal have entered the enclave since the agreement came into effect. Yvette Cooper's visited a warehouse in Jordan, which is full of UK aid awaiting access into the territory.
There's enough wheat in this warehouse alone to feed 700,000 people for a month, and yet there are children in Gaza who are still going hungry. This is wrong and it needs to be fixed. And that's why I'm calling for all of the crossings to be reopened, for restrictions to be lifted, and for a huge flood of aid to go into Gaza, because frankly the people of Gaza cannot wait.
The Prince of Wales has been given the keys to Rio de Janeiro at the start of his 5-day trip to Brazil. He was presented with an honour normally reserved for the Carnival King by Mayor Eduardo Paes on top of Sugarloaf Mountain, where he had a bird's-eye view of the city and the iconic Christ the Redeemer statue. William, who will stage his Earthshot prize and attend the COP30 climate change summit later this week, then had a kickabout with some participants in his programme at the famous Maracanã Stadium. Those are your headlines. Now it's back to Jacob.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. What we learned today is devastating for the BBC's reputation at home and abroad. A leaked internal memo seen by the Daily Telegraph reveals that the corporation doctored a speech by President Donald Trump to make him appear to encourage the Capitol Hill riots.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
According to the whistleblower, the Panorama programme edited together separate parts of Trump's words, added foreboding music and juxtaposed them with footage of the Capitol riots that were shot before the speech had even been made. The aim was to create the false impression that he had exhorted his supporters to take violent action. This is shameful. It's worse than any other editorial legerdemain that we have seen in the past. Far worse than the Martin Bashir interview of Diana, Princess of Wales. The then princess may have been misled, but she wanted to do the interview anyway. Donald Trump has words attributed to him that he simply did not say, and it's a fraud. The BBC, which is funded by you, the public, via tax, presented manipulated footage as a fact to back its own left-wing agenda. For decades, many of us have suspected the BBC of bias, whether over Brexit, Gaza, green policies or cultural affairs, and this is further confirmation of that suspicion. Not only was President Trump misrepresented, but the dossier also flags bias in the coverage of Gaza by the Arabic Service, censorship of transgender debates, and dismissals of complaints raised by the corporation's own standards watchdog. Senior executives, including the Director General, Tim Davie, and the Chairman, Samir Shah, were alerted, but, of course, reportedly they turned a blind eye. Complaints from the Standards Committee were apparently dismissed. Warnings about dangerous editorial behaviour were seemingly ignored. Internationally, this is catastrophic for the BBC's reputation. It shatters it. Foreign governments can no longer be expected to trust the BBC, must damage the standing of the World Service after it has deliberately misrepresented one of the main world leaders. How can the public now be expected to pay a licence fee to fund an organisation that does not uphold impartiality, that lies to its audience to support its own lefty worldview, and that refuses to hold its executives accountable? This scandal should encourage the government to scrap the ridiculous licence fee once and for all. No taxpayer should be obliged to fund a broadcaster that is a front for political activism. This is more than an isolated case of bias. It's malpractice, deception, fraud and cover-up, a stain on the BBC's escutcheon and, by extension, on that of Britain. As always, let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. I'm joined now by the former BBC journalist Tom Bower and my most intellectual panel, Sir John Redwood and Stephen Pound. Tom, let me come to you first, because this is really extraordinary, isn't it, that the BBC Panorama flagship BBC programme has essentially committed fraud to do down the now President of the United States just before the election.
Well, it's much worse than that. Now I'm, of course, a former Panorama producer and reporter for 10 years. What is really awful and what the most revealing part of this report is that it was commissioned internally. These aren't outside critics, right-wing critics, left-wing critics. This is an internal report written by a man called Michael Prescott, who was absolutely outraged that what he discovered when he discovered the distortion, the deliberate distortion of Trump's speech, his warnings and his report was ignored, not only by the head of news, Deborah Turness, and her deputy, Jonathan Munro, but also by the chairman of the BBC, Samir Shah, and the Director General. All of them refused to take any action. So what you're really dealing with, and I say this with great sadness, is a shocking rottenness, a corruption at the top of the BBC. There's clearly a sentiment. We're not going to rely on the truth. We're going to cover up dishonesty. We're going to peddle dishonesty, and we hope to get away with it.
But this is a continuation of their approach of covering things up, as they did with Martin Bashir, as they did with Jimmy Savile, as they did with Hugh Edwards. It just constantly covers up things that it gets wrong.
Well, I mean, it's not only the cover-up. I mean, obviously, on the Bashir Diana, the cover-up went on for over 20 years. And even when it was investigated by a judge, the cover-up continued of the cover-up. I mean, it's still, after all, they redacted hundreds of documents so you don't discover the truth. What is appalling in this case is that the cover-up is so blatant that the internal investigator and reporter, Prescott, actually announces there has been dishonesty, and the chairman and the director of the BBC deliberately ignore his report. And it only comes to us because he distributed it amongst the board of directors, and one of them clearly leaked it to the Telegraph. If it hadn't been for the leak, we wouldn't know. And, of course, this comes after 2 years of the most appalling biased reporting from Gaza, where we can go on to that, but I mean, it's dreadful complaints about that.
Because they had a similar problem with Gaza, where they actually basically just put the Hamas case and didn't admit it.
Well, not only put the Hamas case, but people like Fergal Keane, a reporter in Jerusalem, would use Hamas-supplied material, splice it together with the wailing woman and the dead bodies and all the rest of it, and pretend in his reporting that he was actually in Gaza and had checked the story. He would pronounce constantly 15 dead, 20 dead, and he had no idea how many dead there were and how many living or who the dead were, because he was in Jerusalem relying on Hamas-supplied material. And the shocking thing about that whole Gaza reporting was that Deborah Turness and Jonathan Munro and Tim Davian, all of them, stood by and allowed Hamas to peddle their propaganda through the BBC every day on our state broadcaster.
Stephen, let me come to you. How do you think the BBC recovers from this? Because this is very serious.
I couldn't disagree with you more. I'm not going to die in a ditch for the BBC. Certainly not going to do that. But I think I simply cannot understand what you're talking about here. Look, Donald Trump said those things. Now, if they were put out in a different order, so be it. He still said those things.
He didn't.
There's one fact that we cannot dispute. The day after he was elected as president, he pardoned 1,400 people who'd brought death and destruction onto their Parliament building, the Senate, and actually caused mayhem on that. He pardoned them and he called them hostages.
Yes,
he was complicit and supportive of those people.
This was before the election, so before anyone was pardoned, And the BBC made it look as if he'd encouraged those riots when actually the march was already underway, and he clearly didn't. His phrasing makes it clear that he didn't.
Why, Jacob, would the BBC do that? The electors of America don't listen to the BBC.
But why would the BBC do that? Because the BBC has never liked Donald Trump. The BBC
the BBC isn't a single individual.
It didn't like Brexit, it didn't like Donald Trump, and it plays its tune according to its political
At the risk
views.
of being offensive, you cannot project your own prejudices onto a vast organisation.
Well, I think it's what the BBC does to the rest of us. John, let me bring you in.
Well, of course it does. I think you're absolutely right, Jacob, that this is a disaster for the BBC. It prides itself in being independent and accurate reporting and fact-checks everybody it doesn't like, but nobody fact-checks the BBC, and we then have an internal report saying that this was incorrectly spliced and misrepresented the man who's now the President of the United States, and we don't get an automatic apology and a confession that this has gone wrong. And as you rightly say, there's been all sorts of malpractice and bad people at the BBC without proper apologies. I'm very worried because the BBC is now tiny compared with the 7 American media giants, and those media giants are now supplying things that people want to pay for in the United Kingdom, out-competing the BBC. When people have to pay twice, they have to pay compulsorily for the BBC they don't want to watch, and they have to pay for what they do want to watch. And the BBC doesn't seem to care about that. It doesn't realise how uncompetitive it is and what a disaster it is for the British media industry.
And Stephen, aren't people going to find that they're not going to pay the licence fee to a broadcast that's so biased?
Well, I think this is a different issue. We can argue about the validity and the legitimacy of the licence fee, and I tend to actually agree with you on that. I think it should be voluntary. As it is in America, you can choose to actually subscribe to public broadcasting in America, and you can choose not to. It's entirely your choice. But look, the BBC is actually a very commercial organisation. It makes a lot of money. We talk about the Martin Bashir one. That wasn't actually a BBC production. That was a company for the BBC. And Martin Bashir, the man who faked bank accounts to actually get that interview, was actually not somebody directly employed there. So, but they do make money out of it. So the question is the BBC worth the licence fee? At the moment, I'd say probably isn't.
And how do you defend the Director General and the Chairman not acting on this report, not doing anything about it?
I must admit, I'm not privy to the internal workings of the BBC. There are at least one person who knows much more about this than I will ever know about this. I've only seen the headlines in the Telegraph. I haven't read tomorrow's Telegraph because today isn't tomorrow.
But there should be an automatic apology, isn't it?
But it's got to be investigated first.
Heads should roll.
But it's just fine. It's been investigated.
It's been investigated, exactly.
They're suppressing a report from their own people.
Exactly.
This is not the critics making this up. This is them.
Yeah. I think
and they've got a few honest people there who say that this is wrong, and they try and bury it.
The BBC motto surely is always deputy heads must roll.
In this case, it's the real head which must roll. I mean, Tim Davie has really got to lose his job because he has overseen this cover-up.
Well, there we go. And one wonders what the titans at Ofcom are going to do about this.
They're too busy watching us.
I think that's right. Well, we're much more interesting, so that's why they watch GBNews.
More people are watching.
Anyway, we're very lucky because we've got a spokesman from the BBC saying this. While we don't comment on leaked documents, when the BBC receives feedback, it takes it seriously and considers it carefully. Michael Prescott is a former advisor to a board committee where differing views and opinions of our coverage are routinely discussed and debated. Well, I don't know what the Today programme would do if they never discussed leaked documents. But never mind. Thank you very much to Tom Bauer and my panel, coming up in just a moment.
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Is COP about to flop as world leaders jet into Brazil on private planes to spout a lot of hot air while they lecture the rest of us about cutting emissions? Global CO2 continues to rise. So is it time to drop COP?
Westminster's full of talk, but out here, it's the real world.
Am I allowed to talk now?
No, that's it. This is where it matters, real people and real lives. That's what politics is all about.
The fact that Trump made a good start, no.
Straight answers, no spin, and just a couple of pints. How many fingers have I got up?
About 10.
So join me for Lee Anderson's Real World every Friday at 7 p.m, only on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Martin Daubney. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
We have a very interesting guy in the studio called Will Whitehorn, who's a space expert. And the reason we've got Will in is that NASA have plans to send astronauts to live on the moon. And
it's not how you think, though, is it? It's inside glass bubbles that are going to be made from lunar dust.
OK.
Not in houses.
The American Space Agency's funding research to see if it is possible. And let's get Will, who does believe it's possible. And would you be going, Will?
Well, not to the moon, obviously.
No.
That's going to be a bit expensive. But and I think NASA will be sending astronauts who probably had to train for several years. But I do intend to go to space in the next couple of years, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So how's it going to work? So NASA's unveiling this plan to send astronauts to live on the moon, living in glass bubbles.
Yeah, made of basically moon dust. So there's a huge amount of silica and other similar materials on the moon. And basically using a microwave process, like a microwave oven, of a very sophisticated type, they're going to be able to meld those and construct, and also using 3D, technology, they'll also be able to construct the interiors on the moon. Now, that's because rocketry is expensive, so it'd be very expensive to take them up.
So it's not that you fill a big space container and bring it to the moon full of this stuff and then assemble it there. You're actually going to fabricate it, make it on the lunar surface.
That's one of NASA's plans. So the first mission going back shortly, in which Elon Musk will be involved with the new Starship rocket that you've probably seen. The Starship is the biggest rocket ever built in human history. And that's going to be able to also go to Mars. But it's also going to be able to carry industrial material to space.
Right.
GB News, the People's Channel.
You want to know what's really going on in the corridors of power? Labour don't know what to do with you half the time, and that makes you quite lethal in the chamber. Get behind the headlines with Chopper's Political Podcast. Join me, Christopher Hope, as I sit down with the great and the good of British politics. We'll see where this ruling takes us. These are the stories shaping our nation. Chopper's Political Podcast, available now on all platforms. Listen in and stay ahead.
Well, welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and we were talking about another BBC scandal, but a particularly serious one, and the mailmogs have come in. Kevin says, I rather hope that President Trump does not sue the BBC, because it will be the British taxpayer that will pay. Far better to cancel all BBC work visas and kick it off the permanent seat on the White House press room. And another viewer says, if the BBC is capable of doing this to an American president they didn't like, what would it do to a British PM they also didn't like? That is a very good question. So is COP about to flop? The annual pilgrimage of the global elite hopping on their hydrocarbon-powered private planes to tell the rest of us to cut back on emissions is set to start in Brazil next week. Fuel emissions have gone up instead of down. Major economies such as Russia and China have no plans to reduce or modify their output. A lack of domestic production has led to higher emissions from imports and a perception of hypocrisy from the green agenda's proponents. All lead us to ask, is it time to drop COP altogether? Well, I'm joined by my most intellectual panel, the former Conservative MP and Minister Sir John Redwood, and the former Labour MP Stephen Punt. Stephen, let me come to you first.
Must you?
Well, isn't this all just ridiculous humbug? And with America not there, why does anybody bother?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, you won't often find me, you and Greta Thunberg on the same side of these things. But I have to say, I think on this occasion, I think young Greta has a point. But look, the reality is this conference of partners is pretty much, as you quite rightly said, hot air and talking shop. But interestingly, emissions in China and Russia are actually, China and India are actually going down at the present time. But I think that is due to a recognition of their own internal economics. I don't think that it actually is the people in COP when they were meeting or in any of these places, that they sit in Beijing and in Delhi and say, good heavens, have you heard what they've just said in Brazil? We must dial down immediately. No, it's also the sheer look, as you rightly said, burning hydrocarbon, aviation fuel flooding the heavens, roaring out to Brazil, and it's always in rather pleasant spots, I think, is a terrible, terrible look. Come on, we know what needs to be done, we know what needs to be said, we don't need a jolly.
John, I mean, you've written about this and about the waste of time it is. It surely makes no sense without America there. If the world's largest economy isn't involved, what's the point?
Well, very little sense. And we're now 10 years on from the Paris Treaty, which first set targets and deadlines. And, of course, we're miles off hitting any of those because Most of the big emitters in the world so far have been increasing their emissions throughout that decade when these conferences were meant to be holding them to account and getting them to come up with better targets which would help. But I mean, the very least they could do is hold this online, as long as they got renewable power somewhere to fuel the computers, of course. But it would be a big reduction compared with the jet flying and the air conditioning of the hotels and all the meat they're no doubt eating over dinner when they're telling the rest of us we mustn't do any of those things.
It also slightly worries me that we legitimise that. When you consider they actually had one of these in Baku in Azerbaijan, which is Azerbaijan, as a matter of record, is a kleptocracy run by the Aliyev family. It is a country which, incidentally, I've been banned from ever going to because I'm considered to be too pro-Armenian. I will take that badge. But look, the idea, it legitimised the regime in Baku, who paid a fortune for that, in the same way that some people paid to have the Olympics or to have Grand Prix racing. I'm not entirely sure what is the point, unless you decide if it's next year it must be Baku, then it must be Edinburgh, it must be wherever. I mean, what is the point of it?
Well, the Conference of the Parties is meant to monitor and get people to come up with ever more stringent targets, but it's not working very clearly.
You don't have to do that.
And it's also now, it's a huge attempt at world socialism. It wants the rich countries to give far, far more money as grants to the developing countries under the pretext that they need it for this green transition, which is probably
had I known this was a
going to
Trojan horse
cripple their
for
economies.
socialism, I would have changed my views.
But Stephen, you are in favour of what they're trying to achieve, aren't you?
Who is any sane person would be in favour of trying to reduce global warming? Surely we can agree on that.
Well, because I don't think we're going to achieve it by any of this. I mean, I think it's a pious hope that simply isn't going to happen.
Well, it's better to light a candle and curse the darkness. I think we have to do something. Even if we are becoming energy more efficient within this country.
Yeah, but all the things that are being done by the government here, a rather more extreme version of what was happening before, are actually increasing world CO2. It's mad in its own terms. You know, if I bought a battery car tonight and took it home and plugged it in, they'd burn more gas in a gas power station for me to recharge my car. What's the point of that? And making the battery is so much more CO2 intensive than making something else.
But John, that's exactly what they said when they took lead out of petrol. Remember people said, oh, you can't take lead out of petrol, this is not going to contribute.
Well, I didn't say that. Well, that was a very good idea because I didn't want to breathe it in. That's a very different matter. I don't like dirty emissions, and I'm very glad that they've been cleaning up exhaust.
But isn't that the point you were making, that when emissions fall, this is actually because people are using electricity power more efficiently, which is a natural event in terms of economic development, that the use of more efficient power is simply because your machines get better.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, this is the old, you know, do you use the carrot or the stick, or do you use a carrot-shaped stick? I mean, it's different ways of incentivising people, and I think modern economists, they refer to nudging, and I think maybe COP initially was actually a nudge force. Nowadays, it's a meeting for the sake of meeting. Now, in Northern Ireland...
No, but it's a legal structure. It's meant to be formal targets. Exactly. British courts will let people bring cases and say that the government isn't doing something.
I'm not going to defend that, Sir John.
No, but that interrupts a free market where people make their own choices. I agree with Jacob. I think if people are left alone, they will make very sensible choices. I won't go out and buy things that deliberately use too much energy. I want to have things that cut my energy bill. But I don't want to be made to buy things that don't work as well and are too expensive.
And when the gas price went up, we all turned down our thermostats because gas was very expensive, that there is a natural financial incentive to use energy efficiently, and that all that the green agenda is doing is making the UK uncompetitive.
Where's the evidence for that? Because, I mean,
well, look at our prices. Our energy prices through the roof, and all our factories using a lot of energy are closing.
I think we keep coming. There's two completely different factors here. One is the idea of energy security in this country. I don't want to be enthralled to Putin and the plutocrats and the oligarchs for the rest of time. I want to have our own British energy.
Or Chinese wind farms.
Yeah. Well, I said, let's make them. Look, this is the thing. Why don't we actually transition from carbon industries to sustainable industries? It's unlike the miners who got thrown on the pit after they lost their jobs. People who are not working on North Sea oil and gas should be actually building, using that great engineering skill.
We should be fracking, that's the answer. Anyway, thank you very much to my panel.
Agreed.
In a moment. Soldier F was last week cleared of murdering 2 unarmed protesters in Northern Ireland. With Labour planning to scrap the Legacy Act, other British veterans could soon face persecution by prosecution. Is the state putting its old soldiers back in the firing line?
dinner under the stars tonight?
That reminds me of our travel insurance.
You mean all clear skies?
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News travel destinations forecast.
It's a slightly mixed picture across the Mediterranean at the moment. We've seen a band of rain across Eastern Europe that's now slipping its way into Greece tomorrow, so if you are heading out there, don't forget the umbrella. But many other central areas seeing some quite nice sunshine, but there's another band of rain beginning to push into western Portugal and northwestern Spain. This coming quite soon after they've had localised flooding last week, so there could be some further issues there. That rain band will slip across other areas of Spain, but elsewhere staying largely dry.
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News travel destinations forecast.
Evening, welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Bit of wet weather around tonight and tomorrow. In places, that rain will be heavy too. Staying quite mild, staying quite blustery as well, with the best of any dry and bright weather across the north. Low pressure is dominating, sitting up to the northwest. A whole host of weather fronts and isobars sitting across us, telling us it's going to be windy and, in places, wet lines of rain, just kind of affecting northern England, Northern Ireland, parts of southern Scotland and Wales. The rain particularly heavy over Cumbria, where we do have a Met Office yellow warning in place, returning to southwest England later in the night. Northern Scotland turning a little clearer, could dip down to single figures here, but for most double digits, a very mild night, and some places staying in the teens. A mild start then, but it will be a wet start, particularly over parts of northwest England. Showers coming into northwest Scotland, but actually a good part of Scotland should have a dry start to Tuesday. May even be a bit of sunshine around. Same goes for the north and the west of Northern Ireland, but quite a bit of cloud close by to Belfast. Could be a bit wet here. Certainly looking very wet across Cumbria in the morning. Much of West and South Wales and Devon and Cornwall also starting pretty soggy. The rain getting heavier and more persistent here through the day. That is an area we need to watch, potential for some local flooding and certainly a lot of spray and surface water on the roads. Much of eastern England will stay dry. Quite a bit of cloud around here and still quite breezy, although not as windy as today. The wind strengthening though later in the southwest. Another pretty mild day, double digits, and many places staying in the teens. Wednesday's also looking mild. Again, much of northern Scotland dry and bright with some sunshine. Again, most of England and Wales cloudy with wet weather, particularly over western England and Wales, spreading back towards Northern Ireland and southern Scotland later on. With a bit of brightness across the southeast, we could again get up to 16, maybe 17 Celsius, but again, quite breezy, particularly so in the south.
Decisions made in Washington aren't just shaping America, they're shaping Britain too. From migration to global security, from crime to health. Whatever happens in the White House today
will be felt in your town or city tomorrow.
That's why The Late Show is live from Washington, D.C.
Cutting through the politics to show you what it all means for Britain.
The Late Show live every night at midnight.
Only on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and my show is your opportunity to cut through all the noise and dive in headfirst to some robust debates. Ideas clash.
Situation,
no,
isn't it?
No,
because the failure is
you're deliberately avoiding my point. Nothing's held back.
And if you think this is the end of it, wait for more.
And we do not shy away from the difficult stuff. Sometimes I want to shake people and say, if only you understood. So join me on Jubes & Co. weeknights at 6 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Last week we learned that the man known as Soldier F has been cleared of the murder of 2 unarmed protesters and attempts to kill 5 others during British Army service in Northern Ireland. However, other British veterans may still face prosecution if Labour succeeds in its plans to repeal the 2023 Legacy Act, which affords old soldiers an effective amnesty. In response, 6 former SAS soldiers have publicly criticised Labour's plans, concerned that lawfare against Northern Ireland veterans would escalate as a result, while the amnesty for IRA terrorists is still preserved under the Belfast Agreement. Is it right that the British state should be putting its old soldiers into the line of fire in this way? Well, I'm joined now by former SAS soldier Richard Williams. Richard, thank you very much for joining me this evening. What do your former SAS friends and colleagues think about the way they're being put at risk by this lawfare approach?
Well, quite evidently, as written in our letter, we're extremely unhappy.
and very concerned about what it means, not just for those that served in Ireland in the past, but those that are serving today. If there's this never-ending tail risk, not related to accountability, but related to some form of almost civil industry related to bringing cases against servicemen, not based on evidence, but based on hearsay.
Where would you draw the line? Because clearly people in the armed forces must obey the law, and that if they do things that are illegal, they must be prosecuted for it. On the other hand, soldiers are acting under great pressure, and their job is ultimately, if necessary, to kill people. Where would you draw the line between a proper procedure that ensures the law is followed and protecting soldiers who are doing a very difficult job?
The first point that everybody must make when discussing this is that soldiers are not above and never will be above the law. Their actions must be held accountable to the law and to the sovereign state and those that directed them to do their actions. That is, you cannot compromise with that. The instruments of the state, known as the army or the armed forces, just simply wouldn't work without that. So for those that try to lead us or our arguments down a path indicating that we are proposing to be above or outside the law are disingenuous and manipulative. That is not what we are wanting. In terms of your question, which is related to where should the line be drawn, let's talk into the specifics of this bill. As you know, previously, under the previous government, the Legacy Act effectively produced a sort of time limit to this and allowed those veterans who conducted, in our view and in their view at the time, legitimate military operations 50 years or so ago, are free from this enduring, what feels like persecution. The new bill that is being brought in, as you know, could see from the 12th of December a remedial order being issued where I think 9 or 10 inquests will be presented to the coroner. Then an additional 25 or so will go to the Solicitor General for subsequent coronary investigation. This is quite a significant change from that which people believed and we believed was quite robust.
OK, well, thank you very much, Richard, because I'm now joined by the Shadow Minister for Defence, Mark Francois, and my panellists, John Redwood and Stephen Pound. Mark, let me come to you, because you've campaigned on this for a long time. You campaigned for the bill. I have a nasty feeling when I was Leader of the House, you asked me regularly about when it was being brought forward. It was a very difficult bill to draft, and it took time. But do you think that if a soldier wearing the Queen's uniform murdered somebody 50 years ago, that is not something that ought to be investigated?
The bill allowed for that. The bill allowed for conditional immunity. So, crucially, if compelling new evidence appeared, not something that had been gone over time and time again, but compelling new evidence under the Legacy Commission, that could be investigated. What Labour are proposing is totally lopsided, which would mean that we would restart, in effect, the conveyor belt of inquests, and the first one of which Hilary Benn has virtually admitted is Loch Gall, where 8 IRA terrorists were caught with a digger, with a large bomb in the bucket of the digger, trying to drive it into an RUC station to explode the bomb and then kill all the policemen inside it. The SAS intercepted them and killed them. But Sinn Féin, and this is all about them trying to rewrite the history of the Troubles, want that opened up yet again, even though it took place in 1987. And crucially, even senior Labour figures now are saying this is wrong. Lord West, the former Labour Security Minister, said just the other day we shouldn't be doing this. Lord Glassman, the founder of Blue Labour, said we must reverse it as soon as possible. And Graham String, a very well-respected senior Labour backbencher said to continue this against one side makes no sense. So even senior Labour figures are telling Hilary Benn and the government to change course.
But don't we hold our armed forces to a higher standard than terrorists, and therefore comparing the two is actually not in the interests of the armed services?
Well, it's the government that are giving these people equivalence. This is two-tier justice. Remember, after the Good Friday Agreement, hundreds of alleged terrorists were given so-called letters of comfort, which said that they were effectively immune from prosecution. John Downey, the alleged Hyde Park bomber, his trial at the Old Bailey famously collapsed when he referred to his letter. None of our veterans were given so-called letters of comfort. So this entire process is totally lopsided. And to follow the gentleman's point, Lord Dannatt, the former Chief of the General Staff, head of the Army, said at the weekend, if potential recruits to our armed forces do not believe their government will stand by them when performing their duties in a lawful manner, why risk joining at all? If this bill goes through, fewer people will join the army and more people will leave.
And Soldier F, who has been acquitted, wasn't just acquitted, was he? It was a very resounding judgment.
Judge Lynch KC spent 2 hours delivering it. And at the end, he said that the standard of the evidence that the prosecution had offered were, in the judge's words, well short of what would be required for a prosecution beyond reasonable doubt. He also, and this is instructive, said, as a judge, I cannot examine the demeanour of a piece of A4 paper. The point he was making was, over half a century on, 53 years from Bloody Sunday, of the two people, the two witness statements that he had in front of him, one was from someone who was dead and the other was from someone who refused to appear. So it's practically impossible to bring prosecutions now. So why drag these people through all of that just to help Sinn Féin change history?
Stephen, isn't that right, that this is all a very long time ago? The orders at the time were thought to be legitimate. The inquiries have been pretty comprehensive, and nobody's pretending that Bloody Sunday was handled at all well. But holding the individual soldiers responsible 50 years later on flimsy evidence is persecuting old men.
There's no statute of limitations on this. I think when Mark Francois talked about the Lynch report and his statement, he also said a couple of other things. He said one of the reasons he couldn't proceed with this was because he didn't believe the two soldiers had given evidence. He said that they'd been identified as basic untruths. Secondly, he said there's a complete absence of any military discipline down there. And he said that the idea of shooting unarmed civilians in the back as they're running away is completely against every principle of our armed forces, which I think all of us subscribe to. But the thing that really worries me about this, we had the Savile inquiry, went on for over 10 years.
12.
And it went on for over 10 years. And I remember in the Derry Guildhall going there week after week. David Cameron made a superb statement on the floor of the House. And I still have the letter he wrote back to me afterwards when I responded to it. In that, he said it was a moment of shame for the British Armed Forces. And here's an interesting thing. As president of my local branch of the Royal British Legion, some of the strongest criticism I've heard about this man has been for existing and recent members of the Armed Forces saying that they are actually ashamed of what some of their fellow soldiers did on Bloody Sunday. Now, the fact that they are not remotely typical of our armed forces, and the fact that they are, I would say, very, very much a product of the time, and you and I weren't actually in uniform on Derry, in the Bogside on that day. We didn't have the yellow card. We didn't actually understand the pressure they were on. But the fact remains that you have to hold our armed forces to a higher standard than terrorists.
But, Stephen, what Sinn Féin... 300,000 British regulars served on Operation Banner.
Exactly.
What Sinn Féin are trying to do is to imply that all of those 300,000 soldiers were the same as those at Bloody Sunday.
We won't give them that oxygen of publicity.
No, but that's what your bill does.
No, it doesn't.
I need to give John the final word. Isn't it right that we hold our armed forces to a higher standard than terrorists?
Yes, and I think we do, but it's also right, as Mark has well said, that these cases should only be reopened if there is genuine new evidence. These people should not be constantly retested and retried on things that failed before when they are very old soldiers and fought bravely in their time.
All right. Well, thank you very much. A spokesman for His Majesty's government said, if we had not repealed the previous government's failed Legacy Act, terrorists, including those in the IRA, would have received blanket immunity. We're putting in place a system which is fair, proportionate and safeguards veterans with 6 clear rights and protections. There is no moral equivalence between British veterans who served in Northern Ireland to protect people and the terrorist organisations who were responsible for 90% of Troubles-related deaths. Well, thank you very much to my panel. Coming up in just a moment, the abolitionists are back in force. The former Prince Andrew, already stripped of his titles, and with the royal chaos escalating, anti-royalists are renewing their calls to abolish the monarchy altogether. One of them joins me next.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, Dave.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Mornings don't have to be tiresome, especially if you have the right company.
Wake up to news as it happens, opinion and debate, and of course, a little bit of entertainment too.
Because when the kettle's on, we're on.
That's Breakfast on GB News, a show worth waking up for.
Every morning from 6 a.m.
Only on the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We'll spread the news, you spread the word.
From the school run to the home run, watch a new show for all of Britain.
He can say whatever he wants.
A straight-talking show where all voices are heard.
And, you know, when are we going to stop talking about smashing the gangs and actually do it?
With the stories that matter from every part of our country.
There's a bit of a crash landing there for your Chancellor.
Bold, fearless and standing up for you. That's me, Martin Daubney, 3 p.m. till 6 p.m, weekdays, here only on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster's full of talk, but out here, it's the real world.
Am I allowed to talk now?
No, that's it. This is where it matters, real people and real lives. That's what politics is all about.
The fact is Trump made a good start, no.
Straight answers, no spin, and just a couple of pints. How many fingers have I got up?
About 10.
So join me for Lee Anderson's Real World every Friday at 7 p.m, only on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You want to know what's really going on in the corridors of power? Labour don't know what to do with you half the time, and that makes you quite lethal in the chamber. Get behind the headlines with Chopper's political podcast. Join me, Christopher Hope, as I sit down with the great and the good of British politics. We'll see where this ruling takes us. These are the stories shaping our nation. Chopper's political podcast, available now on all platforms. Listen in and stay ahead.
Britain deserves a newsroom that puts the facts and your voice first.
Well, and that's what you get on GB News. Lively debates, lively conversation.
And we're not afraid to hold power to account.
And each other. So join me, Andrew Pierce.
And me, Miriam Gates, for Britain's Newsroom, weekdays from 9:30 on GB News.
At GB News, we love to hear from you, our loyal community. So drop us a line at gbnews.com/yoursay. There, you can talk to each other and also to the presenters live on air. gbnews.com/yoursay, because GB News is your channel, Britain's news channel.
Debate over the future of the monarchy has dominated the news this week, after the man formerly known as Prince Andrew was stripped of his titles after a succession of scandals relating to Jeffrey Epstein. Now, the Defence Secretary John Healey has said his department is working to take Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's honorary military title of Vice Admiral away, and Buckingham Palace has refused to deny the possibility of revoking his medals, even those he earned during the Falklands War. Naturally, all this royal chaos has led anti-royalists to re-emerge and call for the monarchy to be abolished altogether. One of those is my next guest, the deputy editor of the New Statesman, Will Lloyd, who argues the House of Windsor is rotten to the core. Rotten to the core is quite tough, isn't it?
It is a little bit tough, but I think the most interesting thing we've seen over the last few weeks is not really, it's not pressure from people like me, which is causing calls for the abolition of the monarchy, which is putting pressure on them. I think they're in the process of abolishing themselves. What we've seen from the palace in recent weeks is a series of extraordinary briefings, which, if you read closely, show that William and Charles are almost at each other's throats. They haven't really been able to grip the Andrew problem. They haven't been able to guarantee... I mean, of course, they can't guarantee that there'll never be another Andrew again due to the hereditary principle. We are at perennial risk of Andrews. And it's like watching overpriced lobsters scuttling around in a very narrow vent, biting each other. And I think that all I'm suggesting is that for their own good, the Windsors might like to start thinking about relinquishing the power that they have.
But they don't have a lot of power, do they? They have a status, they have a focus within the nation, but the king doesn't decide to dissolve Parliament off his own bat, he doesn't appoint the Prime Minister, he doesn't veto bills.
In the 1980s, the then Prince of Wales said that there wasn't power, but there could be influence. Now, I'd like to give an example that I think viewers of this programme would find interesting. In June 2023, then King Charles held a reception at Buckingham Palace for members of the Windrush generation. And he had asked a painter to create portraits of them. And it was a very lovely day, and we should all applaud Charles for doing so. I cannot think of a moment in which the palace has talked about something very dear to this channel's heart, which is the grooming gang scandal. I don't believe Charles has said anything about that. I don't believe the Prince of Wales or the Princess of Wales has said anything about that. Why is that? How are they deciding to use their influence?
Well, the Queen has campaigned to protect women against sexual abuse, so they can't comment on every single story that is in the papers.
But Windrush are not grooming gangs?
But
Windrush
is an historic event that took place decades ago, and the royal family is in a much better position and tends to commemorate things that have happened a long time ago that are part of our history, rather than immediate events. Because
Charles briefed out that he thought the Rwanda scheme was appalling. That's not a historic event. I mean, it's the government you were part of.
But he didn't say anything publicly, and he didn't try to stop it. And you know how gossip comes from royals. Briefed out is a very moot point as to whether it's briefed out, because the late Queen's views on Brexit have been briefed in every possible direction.
It's true.
Usually by people with an axe to grind within the debate.
Yes, that's true. But I still don't really understand why it is that Charles, for instance, wore a Greek tie during the Elgin Marbles controversy. I don't really understand why. Another cause dear to this channel's heart, which is, real scrutiny of net zero policies. Where is Prince William this week? He's in Brazil. He is in the sort of global heartland of net zero politics at COP30.
He is the Prince of Wales. He's not the king, and the king has shut up on these subjects since he's become king. He's playing a proper constitutional role.
I think that what I would like to get across to viewers is that should there be the populist government that I think most of them would like to see, a government with a popular mandate that really seeks to smash convention and change this country, and I think we can all agree that we want to see this country change.
Yes.
We're not happy with the state of the nation. The bigger, the permanent bureaucrat of the permanent bureaucracy at this time is the king. I mean, that is the establishment. That is the elite that people watching the show rail against.
The king will not stand in the way of Nigel Farage if Nigel Farage becomes Prime Minister.
We have been told that the heir to the throne, William, well, for one thing, he hasn't read Walter Bagehot's 1867 wonderful work, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, Jacob.
Reasonably.
The English Constitution. He hasn't read this. We've also had a briefing in the Sunday Times that appeared in 2021 that he was talking about the prorogation of Parliament. William said that he would seek to challenge advice like that. Now, very well...
Yes, but he couldn't possibly. But he's not the king.
When he becomes king.
When he becomes king, he will not challenge advice like that. Of course.
But he hasn't read Bagehot.
He would cease being king pretty quickly if he's upset the conventions of a constitutional monarchy.
Are you calling for the abolition of the monarchy, Jacob?
No, I'm not. The constitutional monarchy doesn't stop the Prime Minister doing things. What would you replace it with? That's the key difficulty for Republicans.
I don't like the word Republican, and I do not look at France and feel particularly envious of their situation, nor do I look at Germany and feel particularly envious of their situation. I think that the Windsors have started to reach the end of the road.
All right. I'm going to allow you the last word. God save the King. That's all from me. Up next, it's the one and only Patrick Christys. Patrick, will you play the national anthem to start your programme, just to purify people's ears after that discussion?
Well, I would absolutely love to, Jacob, but we'll have to wait and see. Look, I've got a lot on tonight. I'm talking about how I think we're being gaslit about how everything's actually really safe in Britain. Everything's really safe, actually. All of these isolated incidents. Well, it's not that isolated, is it, if you add them all up? And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing at 9 p.m. tonight. At 10 p.m, I'm going to be talking about the fact fact that thanks to Labour, we now have the highest increase in asylum applications of anywhere in Europe. All of that and much more, 9 to 11 p.m.
Expect warm spells with the odd rude interruption. Boxed Boilers sponsors the weather on GB News.
Evening, welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Bit of wet weather around tonight and tomorrow. In places, that rain will be heavy too. Staying quite mild, staying quite blustery as well, with the best of any dry and bright weather across the north. Low pressure is dominating, sitting up to the northwest. A whole host of weather fronts and isobars sitting across us, telling us it's going to be windy and, in places, wet lines of rain, just kind of affecting northern England, Northern Ireland, parts of southern Scotland and Wales. The rain particularly heavy over Cumbria, where we do have a Met Office yellow warning in place, returning to southwest England later in the night. Northern Scotland turning a little clearer, could dip down to single figures here, but for most double digits, a very mild night, and some places staying in the teens. A mild start then, but it will be a wet start, particularly over parts of northwest England. Showers coming into northwest Scotland, but actually a good part of Scotland should have a dry start to Tuesday. May even be a bit of sunshine around. Same goes for the north and the west of Northern Ireland, but quite a bit of cloud close by to Belfast. Could be a bit wet here. Certainly looking very wet across Cumbria in the morning. Much of West and South Wales and Devon and Cornwall also starting pretty soggy. The rain getting heavier and more persistent here through the day. That is an area we need to watch, potential for some local flooding and certainly a lot of spray and surface water on the roads. Much of eastern England will stay dry. Quite a bit of cloud around here and still quite breezy, although not as windy as today. The wind strengthening, though, later in the southwest. Another pretty mild day, double digits, and many places staying in the teens. Wednesday's also looking mild. Again, much of northern Scotland dry and bright with some sunshine. Again, most of England and Wales cloudy with wet weather, particularly over western England and Wales, spreading back towards Northern Ireland and southern Scotland later on. With a bit of brightness across the southeast, we could again get up to 16, maybe 17 Celsius, but again, quite breezy, particularly so in the south.
Expect warm spells with the odd rude interruption. Boxed Boilers sponsors the weather on GB News.
We're giving you the chance to win your entire Christmas this year paid for by us. First, we'll give you an incredible £30,000 in tax-free cash. Then we'll give you a further £10,000 cash to spend on all your Christmas presents, even the tree. Christmas lunch, that's on us too, with £1,000 in shopping vouchers to spend at your favourite supermarket. Finally, a GB News Christmas goodie bag. For a chance to win, text WIN to 63225. One entry costs £2.50 plus one standard network rate message, or text BONUS to 63225. 5 entries cost £5 plus one standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entry start at £2.50. Call 0903 686 3232. Calls cost £2.50 plus your network access charge, or post your name and number to GB 17 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 4 p.m. on the 28th of November. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand.
Hi, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and my show is your opportunity to cut through all the noise and dive in headfirst to some robust debates. Ideas clash.
Situation, isn't it?
No,
because the failure is
you're deliberately avoiding my point. Nothing's held back.
And if you think this is the end of it, wait for more.
And we do not shy away from the difficult stuff.
Sometimes I want to shake people and say, if only you understood.
So join me on Jubes and Kerr weeknights at 6 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
From the school run to the home run, watch a new show for all of Britain.
So he can say whatever he wants.
A straight talking show where all voices are heard.
And, you know, when are we going to stop talking about smashing the gangs and actually do it?
With the stories that matter from every part of our country.
There's a bit of a crash landing there for your Chancellor.
Bold, fearless and standing up for you. That's me, Martin Daubney, 3 p.m. till 6 p.m. weekdays, here only on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster's full of talk, but out here, it's the real world.
Am I allowed to talk now?
No, that's it. This is where it matters, real people and real lives. That's what politics is all about.
The fact that Trump made a good start, no.
Straight answers, no spin, and just a couple of pints.
How many fingers have I got up? About 10.
So join me for Lee Anderson's Real World every Friday at 7 p.m. only on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You want to know what's really going on in the corridors of power? Labour don't know what to do with you half the time, and that makes you quite lethal in the chamber. Get behind the headlines with Chopper's political podcast. Join me, Christopher Hope, as I sit down with the great and the good of British politics. We'll see where this ruling takes us. These are the stories shaping our nation. Chopper's political podcast, available now on all platforms. Listen in and stay ahead.
I think for far too long in this country, millions of people felt as though they weren't represented at all by the establishment media.
GB News was needed because there literally was no other voice. Everyone was saying the same thing.
GB News exists because there is a desperate need for fearless journalism that puts the people first.
GB News came on the scene as a disruptor, and it has always been a disruptor ever since.
The mainstream is all about keeping the status quo as it is, ticking along quite nicely. They don't want to ask difficult questions.
But journalism is journalism.